The groom hit the floor before anyone realized something was wrong. One moment he was laughing, a glass of champagne lifted halfway to his lips, the string quartet drifting softly through the hall, and the next his body folded in on itself like a man whose strings had been cut. The glass shattered against the polished marble. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped back. Someone shouted his name again and again, as if repetition alone could pull him back from wherever he had just gone. I was standing 10 feet away holding a tray I didn't remember picking up. For a second no one moved. Then everyone did. People rushed in, crowding him, kneeling, hovering, talking over each other. Someone tried to lift his shoulders. Someone else fumbled with their phone, calling for help but not saying anything useful. I saw his face gray already, lips tinged blue, and something inside me shifted into a place I hadn't visited in years. I stepped forward. "Back off, you're just a dishwasher." The words hit hard enough to stop me for half a heartbeat. I didn't look up to see who said it. I didn't need to. I had heard versions of that sentence before, different words, same meaning. Not qualified, not wanted, not anymore. They weren't wrong. But his breathing was wrong. I set the tray down somewhere, I think, and dropped to my knees beside him. "Move," I said quietly. Not loud, not commanding, just certain. No one listened at first. Not until I reached for his jaw and tilted his head back, checking his airway with hands that remembered more than I allowed myself to. Then a voice behind me cut through the noise. "Give her space." It wasn't loud either, but it carried weight. People shifted, reluctantly, just enough. I pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "Pulse irregular, weak." "Call 911 again," I said. "Tell them he's not breathing right." "I already did," someone snapped. "Then stay on the line," I said. I leaned closer, listening to his chest. The rhythm wasn't just off, it was collapsing into itself. I could feel it even without the monitors, without the machines, without the sterile brightness of an operating room. For a moment, just a moment, I hesitated. Because I wasn't supposed to do this anymore. Because the last time I had it had cost me everything. "Are you even trained for this?" another voice demanded. I ignored it. I adjusted his position, cleared his airway, counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. A memory flashed uninvited. Bright lights. The steady beep of a monitor. A younger version of myself standing over a table, hands steady, voice calm. I pushed it away. This wasn't then. This was now. I pressed down on his chest. "Hey, stop." I said, "Back off," I repeated, still calm, still focused. "Unless one of you knows what you're doing." No one answered that. I continued. Compression, breath, compression. The room had gone quieter, though I didn't notice exactly when. The panic had thinned into something else, fear maybe, or waiting. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Oh my God, it's her. I looked up. He was standing just beyond the circle, tall, even with age settling into his shoulders. His suit was dark, formal, the kind worn by men who had spent a lifetime being listened to. But it wasn't the suit that caught my attention. It was his face. Not fear. Recognition. And something else beneath it, something like disbelief. Our eyes met for half a second. Long enough. I looked back down at the groom. "Stay with me," I muttered, though I didn't know if he could hear it. I adjusted my hands, recalibrated pressure. The rhythm shifted slightly under my palms. Not enough. But something... "Ambulance is 2 minutes out," someone called. Good. I kept going. 1, 2, 3. The general stepped closer, his voice lower, now meant only for me. I thought... He didn't finish. Neither did I. There wasn't time. After what felt like too long and not long enough at all, I felt it. A change. Subtle, fragile. But there. I paused just long enough to check again. Pulse faint but present. "Okay," I said quietly, "okay." The room seemed to breathe again with me. Sirens cut through the distance, growing louder. I sat back slightly, not fully letting go, just enough to give space when the paramedics rushed in moments later. They took over quickly, efficiently, their movements sharp and practiced. I answered their questions without thinking. Timing, symptoms, what I'd done. They didn't ask who I was. That part didn't matter. Not anymore. As they lifted him onto the stretcher and wheeled him out, the crowd parted again, this time in silence. The celebration had drained out of the room, replaced by something heavier. I stayed on my knees for a second longer than I needed to. Then I stood. My hands were trembling. I hadn't noticed until then. I walked back toward the service corridor without looking at anyone, wiping my palms on my apron out of habit more than anything else. Wait. His voice stopped me. I turned. He was closer now. The general. Close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way time had settled into him without softening him. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I shook my head. It wasn't entirely true. But it was easier. He studied me as if weighing something. Then he nodded once. "I remember you," he said. I didn't answer. What would I have said? Instead, I turned and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. The noise hit me all at once, running water, clattering dishes, voices overlapping in confusion. Someone asked what happened. Someone else said they thought the groom was dead. I moved to the sink. Turned on the faucet. Hot water rushed over my hands. I stood there for a long time, just letting it run. No one asked me anything. Martha glanced at me once from across the room, her expression unreadable, then went back to directing the staff. That was one thing I'd always appreciated about her. She didn't ask questions people weren't ready to answer. I picked up a plate, started scrubbing. Same as before. Same as always. But my hands didn't quite feel the same. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a door I had kept shut for years had opened just a crack. I didn't know if I was ready for what might come through it. I just knew I couldn't close it again. I stayed at the sink long after the last of the guests had drifted out, and the kitchen settled into its usual end-of-night rhythm. Plates came in slower now. Voices dropped. The adrenaline that had filled the air earlier had thinned into something quieter, uneasy, unfinished. No one mentioned what had happened in the ballroom. Not directly. But I could feel it in the way people moved around me. A glance held half a second too long. A question that almost formed, then didn't. Even Martha, who rarely let anything go unaddressed, kept her distance. I was grateful for that. I didn't trust my voice yet. The hot water kept running, steam rising in soft curls that blurred the edges of everything. I scrubbed each plate with more care than necessary, focusing on the small familiar motions. It was easier that way. Easier than thinking about the man on the floor. Easier than thinking about the man who had recognized me. Oh my God, it's her. I dried my hands slowly and turned off the faucet. For a long moment I just stood there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the faint clatter of someone stacking chairs out front. Then I went back to work. I used to be a trauma surgeon at a VA hospital outside Dayton. That's the kind of sentence people expect to come with pride, or at least a sense of accomplishment. But when I say it now, it feels more like something I'm reading off a file that no longer belongs to me. Back then, my days started before sunrise and ended long after the sky had gone dark again. I lived on bad coffee and routines that didn't leave much room for anything else. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't meant to be. It was work that mattered. The kind where your decisions didn't just shape outcomes, they defined them. Most of my patients were veterans. Men and women who carried things no chart could fully capture, injuries that were visible, others that weren't. I learned quickly that medicine at that level wasn't just about skill, it was about judgment, timing, and sometimes choices you couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. That's where I met Daniel Mercer. He came in late one night, airlifted from a highway accident outside the city. The report said he'd been hit broadside by a truck that ran a red light. By the time he reached us, his condition had already started to spiral. Internal bleeding, head trauma, compromised airway. Everything at once. I remember the moment they wheeled him in, the way the room shifted, not chaotic focused. Everyone knew their role. Everyone moved with purpose. I took one look at him and knew we didn't have time for hesitation. "Prepper 2, I said. "We're going in now." There's a kind of silence that settles over a surgical team right before things begin. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of doubt. You trust the people around you, you trust your hands, and you push everything else aside. That night, everything worked the way it was supposed to. We stabilized him, controlled the bleeding, repaired what we could, managed what we couldn't. When it was over, he was still alive. Barely, but alive. I remember stepping out of the operating room and seeing a man standing in the hallway, tall, straight-backed, not pacing, not fidgeting, just waiting. He looked at me like I had something he needed. He started. He made it through surgery, I told him. The next 24 hours will be critical. He nodded once. No visible relief, just a slight shift in his shoulders. Thank you, he said. I didn't think much of it at the time. We saw families like that every day. What mattered was the patient. Daniel stayed in the ICU for weeks. Complications came and went. Infections, setbacks, small victories that didn't always hold. But he fought. You could see it even when he was unconscious, the way his body resisted giving up. I checked on him whenever I could. Not because he was different. Because he wasn't. He was exactly the kind of patient I had chosen this job for. When he finally regained consciousness, it was quiet. No dramatic moment, no sudden clarity, just a slow return to awareness piece by piece. He didn't remember the accident. That wasn't unusual. What mattered was that he was there. Alive. The day everything changed didn't feel different when it started. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because I had planned to leave early for once. I had even told myself I would go home before midnight. That didn't happen. It never did. Around 8:30 p.m., 2 patients were brought in within minutes of each other. One was Daniel. The other was not. The second patient was older, late 60s, no immediate family present. Cardiac complications layered over an existing condition that had already been declining. Both needed intervention. Both needed resources we didn't have enough of. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Hospitals aren't built for ideal conditions. They're built for reality. And reality means limitations. One operating room was already in use. Another was being prepped. We had 1 ventilator available in the unit. Just 1. I stood there looking at 2 charts that both demanded everything, and knowing I couldn't give it to both. Which one, a resident asked. There are moments in this job when the world narrows down to a single point. This was one of them. Daniel was younger, stronger, more likely to survive aggressive intervention. The other man wasn't. On paper, the decision should have been clear. But paper doesn't always tell the whole story. I made the call. By the time the night ended, 1 patient was stable. The other was gone. I signed the report just before dawn. No hesitation. No explanation beyond what was required. That's what you do. You document, you move on. Or at least that's what I thought. The investigation started 2 weeks later. It moved fast. Faster than anything I had seen before. Questions I wasn't expecting. Conclusions drawn before answers were fully given. A narrative that seemed to take shape without needing much input from me. Medical negligence. Improper allocation of resources. Failure to follow protocol. I read the words over and over again, trying to understand how they fit with what had actually happened. They didn't. But they didn't need to. Someone had to be responsible. And I was the one who had made the decision. I didn't fight it. People have asked me why. Lawyers, reporters, even Martha once in a moment she probably regretted. The answer has never been simple. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was knowing how these things play out. But the biggest part was that I wasn't sure I had the right to defend myself. Not after the choice I had made. I finished the last of the dishes and turned off the lights in the kitchen. The hallway was empty when I stepped out. For a moment I thought I was alone. Then I saw him. Waiting. The general. He didn't say anything right away. Just watched me the way he had in the ballroom, like he was trying to place something that didn't quite fit. You were there, he said finally. It wasn't a question. No, I replied. It came out before I could stop it. A reflex. He held my gaze. You were, he repeated softer now. I shook my head again. And this time I turned and walked past him before he could say anything else. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. The air was cool, quiet. I stood there for a long time, keys in my hand, staring at nothing in particular. Behind me, the building settled into silence. In front of me, the night stretched out the way it always did. Unchanged. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. And I knew, whether I wanted to admit it or not, that whatever I had left behind all those years ago wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go home right away. The engine was running headlights, cutting a narrow path across the empty lot, but I stayed parked, hands resting on the wheel, like I had forgotten what came next. It had been years since anything had followed me out of that hospital, years since anyone had looked at me like they knew who I was before I became someone easier to overlook. You were there. His voice stayed with me longer than I expected. I turned the key, backed out slowly, and drove the long way home. No radio, just the steady hum of the road and the kind of quiet that lets old thoughts rise whether you invite them or not. The next morning started the same as every other. Coffee too weak. Toast I didn't finish. The same worn jacket by the door. I left at the same time, took the same route, and parked in the same spot behind the catering hall. Routine has a way of protecting you. It keeps the past from getting too close. Inside the kitchen was already alive. Pots clanged, orders were being called out for a luncheon event. Someone laughed too loudly at something that wasn't that funny. Normal. I tied on my apron and went straight to the sink. Martha was at the prep table, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses perched low on her nose as she checked invoices. She looked up once when I walked in. "You all right?" she asked. It wasn't prying, just a simple question. "I'm fine," I said. She held my gaze for a moment longer than usual, then nodded and went back to her paperwork. That was the end of it. Or it should have been. By mid-morning, the deliveries started arriving. Produce crates, boxes of glassware, linens for a church reception scheduled later that afternoon. I moved through it all without thinking, stacking, rinsing, organizing, letting the rhythm of the work settle me. That's when I saw him. Not the general. Someone else. He was standing near the service entrance, just inside the doorway, looking like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. Early 30s, maybe. Clean cut. Still dressed in yesterday's suit, though the tie was gone and the collar had loosened. He looked tired. More than tired. "Can I help you?" one of the servers asked him. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved across the room, searching for something. Or someone. Then they landed on me. For a second I considered turning away, pretending I hadn't noticed. But it was too late. He started walking over. "Excuse me," he said, stopping a few feet from the sink. "Were you working the Mercer wedding last night?" The name hit harder than I expected. Mercer. I kept my hands in the water. "Yes," I said. "I was told..." He hesitated like he wasn't sure how to phrase it. "I was told you were the one who helped my brother." Brother. Not groom. Not Daniel. Brother? I dried my hand slowly and turned to face him. "He's alive?" I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended. He nodded. "I see you," he said. "They said if you hadn't stepped in when you did..." He trailed off, swallowing whatever came next. He wouldn't have made it to the ambulance. I let that settle. Not relief. Not exactly. Something more complicated. "I'm glad," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You knew what you were doing," he said. "Not a question this time." I didn't answer. "I mean, that wasn't basic first aid," he went on. "The paramedics said..." "You should talk to them," I interrupted gently. "They weren't there yet," he said. I held his gaze. There was something in it I recognized. Not suspicion, not accusation. Gratitude. The kind that doesn't know where to land. "My father wants to speak with you," he added. There it was. I felt my shoulders tighten before I could stop it. "I'm working," I said. "It won't take long." "It usually does," I replied. He frowned, slightly confused. "You don't understand," he said. "He's been asking about you since last night. He thinks he knows you from somewhere." I turned back to the sink. "People think that sometimes," I said. "It's not like that," he insisted. "I can't help him," I said, cutting him off more firmly this time. The words hung between us. He didn't move. "Look," he said after a moment, softer now. "I don't know what happened last night. Not really. But I know what I saw. You saved my brother's life. That matters." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "It doesn't change anything," I said. "Maybe it should," he replied. I shook my head. "No," I said, "it shouldn't." He left a few minutes later. Not angry, not satisfied either. Just uncertain. I watched him go through the reflection in the stainless steel sink, his figure growing smaller as he stepped out into the daylight. For a long time after that, I didn't move. By the time my shift ended, the kitchen had emptied out again. Martha was the last one still there, wiping down the counters with slow, methodical strokes. "You've got company," she said without looking up. I didn't need to ask who. "I'm heading out," she added. "Lock up when you're done." "Okay," I said. She paused, then glanced at me. "You don't have to talk to him," she said. I nodded. "I know. But I also knew something else. Avoiding things doesn't make them disappear. It just delays the moment they catch up." He was waiting outside this time. Leaning against a dark sedan, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed but watchful. "The general." He straightened when I stepped out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot was quiet again, just like the night before. "You're hard to find," he said finally. "I'm not hiding," I replied. "No," he said, "you're not." There was a faint hint of something in his voice. Respect, maybe. Or understanding. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just want to ask you one question." I didn't answer. "Did you ever wonder what happened to him?" he asked. The words settled into the space between us. Carefully placed. Deliberate. I looked at him. Really looked this time. At the lines etched into his face. The way his shoulders held tension even when he was standing still. The kind of presence that comes from a lifetime of command and the weight that comes with it. "I try not to," I said. He nodded slowly as if he had expected that. "He's alive because of you," he said. I felt something tighten in my chest. "That's what they told me back then too," I replied. And now he asked. I met his eyes. "Now I know better," I said. He studied me for a long moment. Then quietly. "You made a choice." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise either. Just a statement. "Yes," I said. "And you never told anyone why?" I didn't respond. He took a step closer. Why, he asked. The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I looked past him out toward the road where the last light of day was starting to fade. Because it wouldn't have changed anything I said. "That's not true," he said. "It is," I replied. He shook his head. "No," he said. "It would have changed everything." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was familiar. "That depends on who you're trying to protect," I said. Silence settled again. He exhaled slowly like a man adjusting to a truth he didn't like. "I owe you," he said finally. "You don't," I replied. "I do." "You don't," I repeated. He held my gaze. "Then let me ask you this," he said. "If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently?" The question landed harder than the others. Not because I hadn't asked myself the same thing before. Because I had. Every day. I didn't answer right away. When I did, my voice was steady. "No," I said. He nodded once. Not surprised. Not relieved either. Just accepting. "I thought so," he said. Then he stepped back. "Good night," he added. "Good night," I replied. I watched him get into his car and drive away. Then I stood there for a while, the cool air settling around me, the noise of the day finally gone. For years I had convinced myself that what happened back then was over. Closed. Buried. But standing there in that empty lot, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. It hadn't been buried. It had been waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of what he said, but because of what I said. If you had to make that choice again, would you do anything differently? No. It had come out steady, certain. But certainty and peace aren't the same thing. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the old refrigerator in the next room, replaying the question in a dozen different ways. Each time the answer stayed the same. And each time it felt heavier. The next morning I didn't go straight to work. Instead I drove. Not far at first. Just past the usual turn, then a little further. The road opened up as the town gave way to stretches of flat land and older buildings, places that hadn't changed much in decades. I didn't need directions. My hands knew where they were going. The VA hospital came into view, slowly rising out of the landscape with the same quiet presence it had always had. The brick looked a little more worn now, the parking lot a little fuller, but otherwise it was the same. I parked across the street. Didn't get out right away. It had been years since I'd been back. Years since I'd allowed myself to even drive past. From where I sat, I could see the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open and closed as people moved in and out, nurses in scrubs, families carrying overnight bags, veterans walking slower than they probably wanted to. Life going on. Unaffected. Or at least appearing that way. I finally opened the door and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected. I crossed the street slowly, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. Inside, the smell hit me first. Antiseptic, coffee, something faintly metallic underneath it all. It hadn't changed. The lobby looked different, new chairs, updated signage, but the feeling was the same. Controlled, quiet, purposeful. No one stopped me. No one recognized me. That was something I had counted on. I walked down the main hallway past departments I used to move through without thinking. Radiology, cardiology, the ICU wing. I didn't go all the way there. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward a smaller corridor, one most people ignored. Administrative offices. That's where it had started. The door to the old conference room was closed. It used to be open more often than not, a place for quick meetings, case reviews, decisions that needed to be made fast. I stood there for a moment staring at it. Then I pushed it open. The room was empty. A long table, a few chairs, a whiteboard with half-erased notes that didn't mean anything to me anymore. But I could still see it. Not the room as it was now. The room as it had been that night. People sitting where there was no one now, voices overlapping, tension hanging thick in the air. 2 charts on the table. 2 lives. 1 decision. We don't have enough resources. That had been the first thing anyone said out loud. Not a question. A fact. Or 3 is still occupied, someone else added, and ICU is at capacity. We can transfer. No time, I had said. The conversation had shifted then. Faster, sharper. Which patient has better odds? That question again. Always that question. On paper, it was Daniel. Younger, stronger, fewer underlying conditions. The other man, Earl Patterson, I remembered now, wasn't expected to survive aggressive intervention. Not with his history, not with how far things had progressed. But there was something about him. Not in the chart. In the room. The way he looked at me when I first walked in. Not scared, not confused. Just present. As if he understood something the rest of us were still trying to calculate. Make the call. I turned. He was standing in the doorway. Not in uniform that night, just a suit, but the posture gave him away. The same man who had stood outside the OR later. The general. At the time, I didn't know who he was. Only that he wasn't just family. He stepped into the room, his presence shifting the balance without saying much. My son, he said, he's in the other room. Daniel. That was the first time I heard his name. He's stable for now, I replied, but he won't be if we delay. And the other patient, he asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't know. Because I did. He's critical, I said. Multiple complications. Which one has a chance, he pressed. There it was again. Not which one deserves it. Not which one needs it more. Which one has a chance? I looked at the 2 charts again. Then back at him. If it were your son, he said quietly, what would you do? The question had followed me longer than any of the others. Not because it was unfair. Because it wasn't. It was human. And that made it harder. Back in the present, I sat down in one of the chairs, the memory settling over me like a weight I had never fully put down. I hadn't answered him that night. Not out loud. But I had answered. With my hands. With the decision I made next. A soft knock pulled me back. I looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-40s, nurse by the look of her uniform. Can I help you, she asked. I stood. No, I said. I was just passing through. She gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for strangers who didn't quite belong but weren't causing trouble either. All right, she said. Just let me know if you need anything. I nodded. Thank you. I left the room without looking back. But the past didn't stay behind. It followed me down the hallway, through the lobby, out into the cold air. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I drove to a place I hadn't visited in even longer. A small cemetery on the edge of town. No gates, no guards, just rows of stones and a gravel path that curved through them. I parked and walked in. I didn't need help finding it. I had been there once before. Years ago. Quiet, early, before anyone else arrived. I had stood there then just like I did now, looking at a name carved into stone. Earl Patterson. Dates beneath it. A life reduced to numbers. I'm sorry, I had said back then. The words hadn't felt like enough. They didn't now either. I wondered if you'd come back. I turned. He was standing a few yards away. The general. Hands clasped behind his back posture, the same as always. "You followed me?" I asked. "No," he said. "I just know where this road leads." I looked back at the stone. "You knew him," I said. "Yes." "Family." He shook his head. "Number?" I waited. He didn't elaborate right away. Instead, he stepped closer, stopping beside me. "He saved my life once," he said finally. The words settled in slowly. Not what I expected. I glanced at him. "He was a mechanic," I said. "Yes." "And he saved your life?" The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "In ways that don't show up in reports," he said. I looked back at the stone. Something shifted. Not in the facts. In how they connected. "He didn't have a chance," I said quietly. The general was silent for a moment. Then, "He had you," he said. I let out a slow breath. "That wasn't enough," I replied. "No," he agreed. We stood there in silence. Two people tied to the same moment for very different reasons. I told them it was my decision, I said after a while. His head turned slightly. "What?" "The hospital," I clarified. "The report. I said I made the call alone." "You didn't," he said. "I did," I replied. "That's not what I meant." I looked at him. Then back at the stone. "I know," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. "They needed someone to blame," I continued, "and I was already there." "You didn't have to accept it," he said. I shook my head. "Yes," I said, "I did." He didn't argue. Not this time. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. The question felt different from the others. Less about the past. More about what came next. I thought about it. About the kitchen. The sink. The life I had built out of smaller, quieter pieces. "I don't know," I said honestly. He nodded. As if that answer made sense. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "There's something you should know." I paused. Looked back. "The man who died," he said. "Earl, he made a request before he lost consciousness." I felt my chest tighten. "What kind of request?" I asked. The general held my gaze. "He asked us not to let anyone else pay for it." The words landed softly. But they didn't feel soft. I didn't respond. Didn't trust myself to. Instead, I nodded once and walked away. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the drawer I had kept closed. Inside was the letter. The one I had never answered. The one that had arrived weeks after everything ended. I held it in my hands for a long time. Then slowly I opened it. The envelope had yellowed at the edges. I had moved 3 times since it arrived, and somehow it had followed me each time, tucked into shoeboxes, slipped between folded papers, buried under things I told myself mattered more. But the truth was, I knew exactly where it was. I always had. The handwriting on the front was careful, not elegant, just deliberate, like every letter had required effort. My name was written without a title. Not doctor. Not inmate number. Just my name. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on low, and the rest of the apartment dark around me. Outside, a truck passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the wall before disappearing. For a long time I only held the letter. Then I unfolded it. There wasn't much inside. A single page. A few short lines. I had read them once years ago, then folded them back up so quickly the paper nearly tore. This time I made myself read slowly. Earl Patterson had written the letter before the final surgery, or maybe asked someone to write it for him. The words were plain simple without any grand language. He said he knew his chances were poor. He said he knew doctors had to make choices regular people would never understand. And then he wrote something I had spent years trying not to remember. "If it comes down to me or somebody younger, don't let them waste it on an old man who's already had his turn." I put the letter down. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I pressed my hands flat against the table as if the wood might steady me. For years I had told myself I accepted blame because I made the decision, because the outcome was mine, because no matter what anyone said, Earl Patterson had still died after I chose against the math, and against the policy, and against the safer version of the truth. But that letter complicated everything. It always had. That was why I kept it hidden. Not because it accused me, because it forgave me. And forgiveness, when you don't feel you deserve it, can feel harsher than judgment. The next morning, Martha found me standing behind the restaurant before sunrise. I was early by nearly an hour. The alley still smelled of rain and old cardboard. A delivery truck had left muddy tracks near the back door, and the trash bins leaned slightly from the wind. "You sleep here now?" she asked. I turned. She was carrying 2 coffees. She handed one to me before I could refuse. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "That makes 2 of us." We stood there for a while, sipping coffee in the gray light. Martha owned the catering company with the stubborn pride of someone who had survived too many bad months to be easily impressed by good ones. Her husband had started it 30 years ago as a sandwich counter. After he died, people assumed she would sell. She didn't. She kept the place open through rising rent, broken ovens, late invoices, and brides who wanted champagne taste on soup money. She had hired me without asking questions. That wasn't common. I owed her more than I ever said. "Hospital called," she said finally. My hand tightened around the paper cup. "They called here." "No, they called me because the groom's family asked where you worked. I didn't give them anything personal." "Thank you." She looked at me sideways. "They already know enough, don't they?" I didn't answer. Martha took another sip. "He lived," she said. I heard. "Good. Yes." She watched me carefully. "You want to tell me who you used to be?" I almost smiled. "Not really." "That's fair." A small silence passed. Then she said, "But maybe you ought to tell yourself." By noon I was back at the sink. Work helped. It always had. The body understands labor better than memory. Soap, water plates, silverware, things that could be cleaned, things that came out better after pressure. Around 3, the back door opened. I looked up. Daniel Mercer's brother stood there again. This time he wasn't alone. The general was with him. Martha stepped between them and the kitchen before I could speak. "We're closed for private prep," she said. The general gave her a polite nod. "We won't stay long." That's what people say before staying long. A faint smile touched his face. "I understand." I dried my hands slowly and came around the sink. "It's all right," I told her. Martha didn't move right away. Then she stepped aside, but not far. "That was Martha. She gave space without abandoning you." The brother looked exhausted. His eyes were red, but his posture had softened. "He's awake," he said. I felt the words before I understood them. "Daniel." He nodded. "He asked what happened. We told him a woman from the kitchen saved him." I looked down. "Then you told him too much." "No," the general said quietly, "not enough." I met his eyes. He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper. For one terrible second I thought it was another letter. It wasn't. It was a photograph. He laid it on the stainless steel prep table between us. I didn't touch it. The photo was old, slightly faded. A younger version of the general stood beside Earl Patterson outside what looked like a motor pool in the desert. Both men were dusty, tired, smiling in the worn-out way soldiers smile when the worst of the day is behind them. But that wasn't what stopped me. Standing between them was a much younger woman in surgical scrubs, hair pulled back, face half turned away from the camera. Me. I stared at it. "I don't remember this," I said. "I know," the general replied. "You weren't meant to. It was taken after the convoy attack. You were attached to the forward surgical team for 3 weeks. The brother looked from him to me. "You served." I shook my head slowly. "Civilian trauma contractor, short rotation. It was before the VA." I had almost forgotten the photo existed because I had almost forgotten the woman in it. Almost. The general tapped the edge of the picture. "Earl kept this." My throat tightened. "He never told me." "He didn't talk much," the general said. "Not about important things." For the first time his voice changed. Just a little. Enough. "He wasn't just a mechanic," he continued. "He was the man who pulled me out of a burning vehicle when I couldn't move. Took shrapnel doing it, never wrote it up, never asked for a medal, said medals were just metal and paperwork." A quiet sadness moved through his face. "That was Earl." I looked at the photograph again. The false shape of the past shifted once more. I had thought the general remembered me because of Daniel. But he remembered me because of Earl too. Because long before that hospital night, all 3 of us had stood in the same dust under the same hard sun, doing what needed doing and pretending it hadn't marked us. The general looked at me, and when he spoke again his voice was lower. "You saved my life in that field hospital," he said. "Then years later you tried to save the man who saved mine." No one in the kitchen moved. Even Martha had gone still. I swallowed. That doesn't make me innocent. No, he said gently, it makes you human. That nearly broke me. Not the praise. The mercy in it. I turned away and put both hands on the edge of the sink. For years I had worn guilt like punishment because punishment at least gave shape to the loss. But standing there with that photograph on the table, I felt something more frightening than guilt. I felt the possibility that my story was not as simple as I had made it. And I didn't know what to do with that. I asked them to leave the photograph on the table. Not because I wanted to look at it, because I wasn't ready to touch it. The general nodded as if he understood, though I wasn't sure anyone could. Daniel's brother glanced at me once, then followed him toward the back door. Martha watched them go with her arms crossed, her face unreadable in that way of hers. When the door closed, the kitchen seemed to settle around me. The hum of the refrigerator came back. A pot clicked on the stove. Somewhere in the dining room a chair scraped against the floor. Ordinary sounds. Merciful sounds. Martha stepped closer to the table and looked down at the photograph. Well, she said quietly, that explains your knife skills. I let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Almost. She didn't smile, neither did I. For a while we just stood there, two women past the age of pretending silence always needed fixing. Then she said, "You planning to run again?" I looked at her. Again. Don't act like you haven't been running since the day I hired you. I wanted to deny it. But Martha was not a woman you lied to if you respected her. I didn't know what else to do, I said. She nodded once. That's different from not having a choice. The words landed harder than I expected. I looked back at the photograph. My younger face stared from the past, half-turned, unaware of everything that would come after. I hardly recognized her. Not because she looked different, but because she still believed usefulness and worth were the same thing. I made the call, I said. I know. No, Martha. You don't. My voice sharpened before I could soften it. People keep trying to turn it into something noble. It wasn't. I stood there with two lives in front of me and I chose. One man lived, one man died. That is not poetry. That is not redemption. That is blood math. Martha didn't flinch. No, she said, it's not poetry. I waited. She picked up a towel and folded it slowly, carefully, as though giving her hands something to do while her mind worked. But I've run this place long enough to know something about choosing, she continued. When there isn't enough money to pay every bill, you pick one. When two workers need hours and the register can only carry one of them, you pick one. Smaller stakes, sure. But the feeling is the same. Somebody always pays. I looked away. That doesn't make it right. No, she said, but it makes it real. That was Martha's way. No comfort she didn't believe in. No easy forgiveness. Just truth laid down plain. I went back to the sink. The lunch rush came in heavy and strange. Everyone had heard something by then, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Rumors travel faster than food in a restaurant. By 2:00, one of the servers was whispering that I had been a battlefield doctor. By 3, another said I had operated on a senator in Iraq. By 4, someone claimed I had been framed by the government, which would have been almost funny if any part of it felt funny. I kept my head down. Scrubbed pans. Rinsed glasses. Stacked plates. Around 5, Martha came back holding the office phone. For you. I dried my hands. Who is it? Hospital. My first instinct was to say no. My second was worse. It was to listen. I took the phone. Hello. A woman's voice came through, professional but cautious. Is this Eleanor Hart? I hadn't heard my full name spoken in that tone for years. Yes. This is Claire Benton, patient advocate at St. Anselm Medical Center. Mr. Daniel Mercer has asked to speak with you. I closed my eyes. I'm not family. He knows. I'm not his doctor. He knows that too. The line went quiet. Then the woman added softer, he said he won't ask again. That was unfair. Or maybe it wasn't. I opened my eyes. When? Tonight, if possible. I looked across the kitchen. Martha stood near the stove, pretending not to listen and listening to every word. I'll come after my shift, I said. After I hung up, Martha pointed toward the door. Go now. I have 2 hours left. And I have 6 people who can wash dishes badly until close. Martha. Don't make me fire you just to get you moving. So I went. The hospital room was dim when I arrived. Daniel Mercer lay propped against pillows, pale and bruised by machines, though not nearly as fragile as I had expected. His brother sat in a chair by the window. The general stood when I entered. Daniel turned his head. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You look different." I almost smiled. "So do you." His mouth moved as if he wanted to laugh but didn't have the strength. "They told me you saved me. I helped until the paramedics came." That sounds like something a person says when they don't like being thanked. It's something a person says when it's true. He studied me. "I remember you," he said. That surprised me. "From the VA." He nodded faintly. "Pieces, voices mostly. Your voice was calm." I looked down at my hands. He took a slow breath. "My father told me about that night. Years ago. Not everything. Enough." The general's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Daniel continued, "I spent a long time angry at you." "I know." "You don't know." "No," I said. "I suppose I don't." His eyes shifted toward the ceiling. "I thought you had decided I was worth more." The room went still. There it was. The ugly center of it. I looked at him. "I didn't. I know that now." "No," I said quietly. "You need to hear me say it. I didn't choose you because of your name, or your father, or your future. I chose what I believed gave both patients the best chance under impossible conditions, and I was wrong about part of it." His eyes glistened, though his voice stayed steady. "Which part?" I thought I could carry it alone. The general looked away. Daniel swallowed. "My brother wants to sue the hospital," he said. I glanced toward the window. His brother didn't deny it. "That's your choice. We need your testimony." There it was. The real reason. Or one of them. I felt the old fear rise, not fear of prison, not even shame. Fear of being dragged back into rooms where words became weapons, and truth became whatever powerful people could afford to shape. Daniel watched me carefully. "I won't ask you to ruin your life again," he said. "You might not have to ask." The general stepped forward. "Eleanor." I turned to him. "You've already paid more than your share," he said. That should have comforted me. Instead, it angered me. "My share," I said. "Earl died. Daniel lived with guilt he didn't earn. Your family carried a lie. The hospital kept its reputation, and I hid in a kitchen because hiding was easier than standing in public and saying I did the best I could, but the best I could was not enough." No one spoke. I looked at Daniel. "I'll testify," I said. His brother stood straighter. "But not for revenge," I added. The room held its breath. "I won't help you turn Earl into a weapon. I won't help you turn me into a saint. And I won't pretend the past becomes clean because a courtroom finally hears it." Daniel nodded slowly. "What do you want then?" I looked at the machines beside his bed. The steady lines, the fragile proof that life was still happening. I want the truth recorded somewhere it can't be buried again. For the first time, the general's face changed. Not shock. Not pride. Something quieter. Relief, maybe. Or grief, finally finding a place to sit down. That night when I left the hospital, the air felt colder than before. I walked to my car, slowly aware of every step. I had spent years believing silence was my punishment. Now I was beginning to understand it had also been my refuge. And stepping out of it would cost me. Maybe more than I wanted to pay. But some debts don't ask whether you are ready. They simply come due. The hearing wasn't held in a courtroom. That surprised people. Daniel's brother had expected something louder. Lawyers, reporters, a room full of strangers waiting to see who would break first. Instead, the hospital's legal team pushed for an internal review panel, 3 physicians, 1 administrator, 1 outside observer, quiet, controlled, recorded but not public. But part of me was relieved. Part of me knew exactly why they wanted it that way. Truth is easier to manage when fewer people are listening. I wore the same jacket I had worn to work for the past 2 years. Nothing special, no statement. Just something that felt like mine. The room itself was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was remembering a different room. There were so many of them back then: conference tables, fluorescent lights, chairs arranged for decisions no one wanted to own. Daniel sat at the far end, still pale but upright, his brother beside him. The general stood near the wall, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. When I walked in, no one announced me. No one needed to. I took the empty seat across from the panel. Ms. Hart, the administrator, began polite but distant thank you for coming. I nodded. We'd like to review the events of... I know what you'd like, I said gently. Let's not waste time pretending this is about clarification. A flicker passed across his face. One of the physicians, older gray-haired, leaned forward. Then tell us what you believe it is about. I held his gaze. Responsibility, I said, and what we're willing to admit about how it gets assigned. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. They asked their questions. I answered them. Not defensively, not emotionally, just plainly. 2 patients, limited resources, 1 decision. They tried to circle back to protocol, to guidelines, to the framework that makes difficult choices look structured on paper. I didn't argue the framework. I told them where it broke. You had a triage system, I said. It favored projected survival rates. It favored patients with fewer complications. It also unofficially favored patients whose outcomes mattered more to the hospital. The administrator shifted in his chair. That's an unfair characterization. No, I replied. It's an incomplete one, but not unfair. I glanced at Daniel. At the time, I believed following the system would lead to 1 death. Breaking from it might save both. I was wrong. The gray-haired physician spoke again. And knowing what you know now. The same question. A different room. I didn't hesitate. I would make the same call, I said. Daniel's brother inhaled sharply. The administrator looked almost satisfied, as if that answer confirmed something he wanted on record. But the physician didn't move on. Explain, he said. I nodded. Because the decision wasn't about choosing one life over another, I said. It was about refusing to let the system decide without challenge. I believed there was a path that gave both men a chance. I took it. I failed one of them. That failure belongs to me. But so does the refusal to accept that the outcome was predetermined by policy. The outside observer, a woman I hadn't noticed speaking yet, leaned forward. Why didn't you say this before? That question mattered more than the others. I thought about it. Because it wouldn't have changed anything I said at first? Then I shook my head slightly. That's not entirely true, I corrected myself. It would have changed how the hospital defended itself. It would have exposed decisions made above my level. It would have made a larger problem visible. And I chose not to do that. Why, she asked. I looked down at my hands. Then back up. Because I was tired, I said. And because I believed protecting the system might protect future patients more than dismantling it would. The room absorbed that. Not agreement. Not condemnation. Just recognition. They brought up Earl Patterson's letter. I hadn't expected that. The administrator slid a copy across the table. We obtained this from Mr. Patterson's records, he said. It appears he expressed a preference regarding treatment prioritization. I didn't reach for it. I've read it, I said. And yet you did not include it in your original report. Number. Why? Because a patient's willingness to sacrifice himself doesn't remove the physician's responsibility to try. The gray-haired doctor nodded slowly. That's consistent with medical ethics. It's also consistent with human guilt, I said. That earned a few faint reactions. When the questions ended, the room grew still. The administrator folded his hands. The panel will deliberate and issue a statement, he said. I stood. I'm not here for your statement, I replied. He blinked. Then why are you here? I looked at Daniel. For him, I said, and for the record. The outside observer spoke again. What do you want the record to reflect? I took a breath. That the system failed 2 patients that night, I said. Not just 1. That responsibility was narrowed to a single decision because it was easier than examining the structure that created it. And that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't prevent harm, it just changes who carries it. No one wrote that down immediately. But I knew it would be recorded. Somewhere. Afterward, there were no announcements, no dramatic exits. People stood, papers were gathered, chairs moved. Daniel approached me slowly. You didn't clear your name, he said. That wasn't the goal. They're still going to say you were wrong. I was wrong, I said. He studied me. Not the way they mean. I didn't answer that. His brother stepped forward next. We're not filing the lawsuit, he said. That surprised me. Why? He glanced at Daniel. Because this isn't something a settlement fixes. No, it wasn't. The general waited until the others had gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. You gave him back his life twice, he said. I shook my head. I gave him time, I corrected. What he does with it is his. He nodded. That's more than most people get. We walked out together. Not as allies. Not as strangers either. Something in between. A week later, I went back to work. Same sink. Same plates. Same rhythm. Nothing about the kitchen had changed. But I had. Not in a way anyone else could see. Martha handed me an envelope around mid-morning. No return address, she said. Inside was a short note. No signature. Just a single line written in careful, deliberate handwriting. You did what I couldn't ask you to do. I knew who it was from. I folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. Then into my pocket. There was also a check. I left it in the envelope. Money doesn't settle debts like that. That evening after closing, I stayed behind again. The kitchen was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned. I stood at the sink, hands resting on the edge, looking at the reflection in the steel. For years I had seen only what I lost. The title. The career. The version of myself that moved through the world with certainty. Now I saw something else. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Just continuity. A life that hadn't ended when everything else did. A life that had changed shape. And maybe in some ways grown more honest. If you've listened this far, I won't tell you what to think about what I did. I won't ask you to decide whether I was right or wrong. Life doesn't divide itself that cleanly, no matter how much we want it to. But I will say this. There are moments when you won't have enough information, enough time, or enough certainty to make a perfect choice. And you'll have to choose anyway. When that moment comes, I hope you choose with as much care as you can carry, and that you find a way afterward to live with what that choice costs. If this story meant something to you or reminded you of a moment you've had to carry, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, quiet, complicated, and human, you're always welcome here.